In the winter of 1923, at the edge of the world where the northern wind screams louder than any man lived, Kael, at 22 years old, he was a silent shadow in a world of iron and ice, a mute mule driver, born into a silence that most mistook for weakness. In the lawless mining camps of the frozen frontier, silence wasn't just a trait, it was a target. The heavy barrel of a Winchester rifle pressed cold against Kael's temple, the metal stinging his skin in the sub-zero air. Behind the weapon stood Baron, the camp's ruthless overseer, his eyes burning with a desperate, greedy fire. "No one is coming for you, boy," Baron hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and malice. "In this wilderness, a mute thief is just another corpse the snow will swallow by morning." Kael stood at the edge of a jagged ravine, his back to a 1,000-foot drop, unable to utter a single word to plead his innocence or expose the truth about the gold Baron had stolen. But as Baron's finger tightened on the trigger, the wind died down, replaced by a sound that made the armed men freeze. It wasn't a scream, and it wasn't the wind. It was a low, guttural vibration that shook the very stones beneath their boots. From the swirling white mist above the cliffs, 2 amber eyes ignited like dying embers, followed by dozens more. The debt was due, and the wilderness had come to collect. CTA section. If you believe that mercy can warm even the coldest hearts, and that a single act of kindness can change destiny, please subscribe and share this story. Your support helps us continue to bring you these powerful, true-to-life narratives of impossible bonds and miraculous rescues. What would you do if the only witness to your innocence wasn't human? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of this journey. The dawn at Iron Crag never felt like a beginning, but rather a grey continuation of a nightmare that refused to end. Kael woke to the sound of ice cracking against the entrance of his shallow cave, a jagged fissure in the mountain that offered just enough shelter to keep the frost from stopping his heart. His lungs felt heavy, filled with the residual coal dust that permeated every inch of the valley, a toxic veil that even the fiercest blizzards couldn't fully wash away. He rose from his bed of frozen pine needles, his joints popping like dry twigs, and began the mechanical process of preparing for the day's labor. There was no breakfast, only the metallic tang of melted snow and the fading memory of a time when he wasn't a beast of burden. As he walked toward the camp's central hub, his boots crunched through a layer of soot-stained powder, each step a testament to his endurance in a place designed to break men. The central office of the mine was a monument to corruption, a leaning structure of rotting cedar, where Baron sat like a bloated spider in the center of a web. Baron was a man whose soul had long ago been replaced by the tally of gold ounces his face, a roadmap of scars and broken capillaries earned in the pursuit of other men's labor. Kael stood before the porch, the heavy logbook in his hand, representing a week of transporting high-grade ore through the Blackwood Pass, a route that had claimed the lives of 3 mules and 2 men in the last month alone. He held the paper out, his hand steady despite the tremors of exhaustion, but Baron didn't even look at the ink. The overseer stood up his heavy fur coat, making him look twice his actual size, and leaned over the railing to spit a dark stream of tobacco at Kael's feet. "You're late, freak Baron," growled his voice, a gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate with a constant simmering violence. He reached into a small iron box and pulled out a single tarnished copper coin, flicking it into the slush with a look of utter contempt. It was a fraction of what Kael was owed, a calculated insult meant to provoke a reaction that the mute youth couldn't articulate. Kael didn't move. He simply stared at the coin, his expression a mask of stoic defiance that infuriated Baron more than any verbal protest ever could. A crowd of miners began to gather, their faces gaunt from the lack of rations, their eyes hollowed out by the relentless darkness of the shafts. They were men who had lost their humanity in the pits, and they looked at Kael as a vessel for their own self-hatred. Grogan, a man whose hands were permanently stained black by the ore, stepped forward and snatched Kael's tattered satchel, the one containing a few scraps of salted pork he had been saving for 3 days. The crowd jeered as Grogan held the bag over the communal fire pit, the flames leaping up as if eager to participate in the cruelty. Kael lunged forward, but the miners formed a wall of shoulders and elbows, shoving him back into the mud with a synchronized brutality. He watched as his only meal was consumed by the fire, the scent of burning fat, a cruel mockery of his hunger. He didn't cry out, for the world had stolen his voice long ago, but his eyes held a fire of their own, a quiet, cold burning that made even Grogan hesitate for a split second. Baron laughed from the porch, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a grave, and ordered everyone back to the pits. Kael was left in the slush, his clothes soaked through with freezing water, his stomach cramping with a hunger that had become his only constant companion. He remembered Silas, the old miner who had taken him in when his own family had abandoned him to the silence. Silas had been a man of books and quiet wisdom, a survivor who believed that even in the darkest hole a man could maintain his internal light. On the night Silas passed away, his breath coming in shallow gasps, he had told Kael that the mountain had a soul and that it rewarded those who showed mercy when it was least expected. That promise was the only thing that kept Kael's boots moving. He lived in a solitude so profound it felt like a physical weight, a silence that he had turned into a fortress. He watched the way the camp operated, noting the hidden ledgers Baron kept, and the way the gold was secretly diverted to a private stash under the floorboards of the office. He saw everything, heard everything, and said nothing. This was his power, the clarity of the observer, who is never distracted by the sound of his own voice. Every delivery he made was a gamble with death, the narrow trails winding along the edges of precipices, where a single misstep meant 1,000-foot fall. He cared for his mules with more tenderness than he showed himself, knowing that their survival was inextricably linked to his own. He spoke to them with his hands, a gentle pressure on the neck or a steady pull on the reins that conveyed more than any whip ever could. Yet the miners saw this as further proof of his strangeness, a freakish bond with animals that they viewed as mere tools. They didn't understand that in a world without words, the language of touch and intent was the only truth left. Kael's cave was filled with small carvings he had made, from driftwood and stone effigies of animals and spirits that he used to populate his lonely world. He was a creator in a place of destruction, a man who built beauty in the heart of a coal mine. Baron's tax collectors came every week, stripping away what little he had left, claiming it was for the maintenance of the trails. It was a slow, systematic robbery that aimed to turn Kael into a debt slave, a permanent fixture of the Iron Crag. But Kael had a plan, a secret hope of crossing the southern passes when the thaw finally arrived. He was a survivor of 1,000 small deaths, each insult and injury, a layer of armor that made him impenetrable to the camp's malice. He knew the mountain was watching, that the balance of the valley was tipping toward a breaking point. The winter of 23 was different. The air felt charged with a prehistoric tension, as if the land itself was preparing to purge the filth that had settled in its canyons. Kael stood on the high ridge, looking down at the flickering lights of the camp, feeling like a ghost haunting his own life. He was the silent foundation of their greed, the one who carried the weight they were too lazy to bear, and he knew that his silence would eventually be the loudest thing in the valley. The promise to Silas was not just a memory, but a living fire that warmed his blood against the sub-zero reality of his existence. He was Kael, the mute driver, the man who listened to the mountain's heartbeat, and he was still waiting for the moment when the debt would finally be settled. The indifference of the Iron Peaks was his only comfort, their unmoving presence, a reminder that the cruelty of men was but a temporary stain on the ancient stone. As the shadows stretched long and thin across the mining floor, Kael retreated to his sanctuary. The silence of the night wrapping around him like a heavy protective blanket. He was a man made of silence and survival, and the Iron Crag had yet to see the true depth of his resolve. The memories of the great storm of 3 years ago were the only warmth Kael had during the freezing nights of the current winter. It had been a time when the sky itself seemed to shatter, raining down shards of ice that buried the world in a week-long whiteout. Kael had been scouting a high-altitude pass for a potential new ore route when he heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind, a low, rhythmic thumping of something heavy struggling against the earth. He followed the sound to a limestone overhang, where a massive shelf of slate had recently collapsed under the weight of the snow. Trapped beneath the debris was a creature that seemed to be forged from the very mist of the peaks, a silver-grey wolf of impossible size, its presence commanding even in its state of total vulnerability. The wolf's left hind leg was pinned beneath a slab of rock the size of a wagon wheel, the bone crushed and the fur matted with dark, frozen gore. Most men would have seen a valuable pelt or a dangerous predator to be finished off, but Kael saw a reflection of his own trapped spirit. He discarded his heavy pack and knelt in the freezing slush, his hands searching for a purchase on the slick surface of the stone. For hours, he labored in the howling gale, using a sturdy cedar branch as a lever to slowly, agonizingly shift the weight of the mountain. When the rock finally slid away, the wolf didn't lunge. It simply collapsed, its amber eyes locked onto Kael's face with an intensity that felt like a physical connection. The blizzard had fully arrived, by then making descent impossible, so Kael dragged the injured predator into the deeper recesses of the cave. He built a small fire from the dry moss and twigs he had scavenged, the flickering orange light dancing across the wolf's silver chest and revealing a unique star-shaped patch of white fur. For 7 days they existed in a shared bubble of survival, the line between man and beast blurring in the face of the absolute cold. Kael shared his meager rations of dried meat, holding out the strips on his palm with a stillness that signaled peace. The wolf, initially baring its fangs in a reflexive snarl, eventually understood the intent behind the gesture. By the 3rd day, the animal was taking food from Kael's hand with a gentleness that was almost reverent. At night they huddled together, Kael pressing his back against the wolf's thick, furnace-hot flank to keep his blood from freezing in his veins. He tended to the animal's leg, washing the wound with melted snow and binding the shattered limb with strips of cloth from his own tunic. There were no words, yet the air in the cave was filled with a profound understanding, a dialogue of souls that transcended the need for speech. Kael spoke to the wolf with his presence, showing it the same mercy he had always wished the world would show him. He saw the way the wolf watched him move, its golden eyes studying the way he tended the fire and the way he looked toward the white wall of the storm outside. It was a witness to his humanity in a world that had forgotten he had any. When the storm finally broke on the 8th day, revealing a world of blinding diamond dust and azure skies, the wolf stood up on 3 legs, testing its strength. It walked to the mouth of the cave, stopping just long enough to press its cold, wet nose against Kael's cheek, a silent vow of brotherhood that Kael felt in the very marrow of his bones. Then, with a single fluid movement, the silver ghost vanished into the pines, leaving Kael alone with the cooling embers of his fire. He returned to the Iron Crag, a changed man carrying a secret that was more valuable than any gold vein in the valley. He never spoke of the wolf, not even to Silas, but the memory became his fortress. Every time Baron humiliated him or Grogan struck him, Kael would close his eyes and feel the phantom warmth of silver fur against his back. He knew that out there in the wild heart of the high country there was a being that knew his worth. The debt was not a burden, but a bond, a silent cord of gratitude that stretched across the miles of ice. He understood that the mountain had seen his act of mercy and that the wilderness never forgot a kindness. His life at the camp continued its brutal rhythm, but he moved with a new sense of purpose, his eyes always scanning the ridgelines for a flash of silver or a star of white. He had learned that the loudest voices in the camp were the emptiest, and that the truest power lay in the things that were never said. The wolf was a part of him now, a silent guardian that lived in his dreams and fueled his endurance. He lived for the moments when he could escape the soot of the mines and breathe the clean air of the peaks where the memory of the amber eyes was most vivid. He knew that the world was cruel, but he also knew that it was capable of miraculous connections. The secret beneath the white powder was his light in the darkness, a promise that even a mute mule driver could be a king in the eyes of the wild. He prepared his sleds with a mechanical precision, his mind always wandering back to the cave and the silver alpha that had shared its life with him. The winter of the present felt less daunting because he had survived the winter of the past with a god at his side. He was Kael, the man who brought fire to the wolf, and that knowledge was enough to keep him standing when the world tried to push him down. The silence of his cave was no longer empty. It was full of the echo of a heartbeat that wasn't his own, a reminder that mercy once given never truly disappears from the earth. The descent of the winter season brought a predatory hunger to the Iron Crag, not just in the bellies of the men, but in the calculating mind of Baron. He had watched Kael for years, growing increasingly unsettled by the youth's ability to remain unbroken despite the systematic stripping of his wages and his dignity. To Baron, Kael's silence was a mirror that reflected his own cowardice, and the overseer knew that as long as the mute driver lived, the truth about the missing gold shipments remained a vulnerability. The plan began to take shape during a week of record-breaking low temperatures, a time when the camp was on edge and the law was as thin as the ice on the creek. Baron waited until the graveyard shift, when the only sounds were the groaning of the mine timbers and the heavy snores of exhausted men. He entered the central office, his shadow lengthening against the walls like a dark stain, and opened the floorboard where he had hidden the high-grade ore stolen from the last 3 deliveries. He pulled out a heavy leather pouch, the weight of the raw gold inside, feeling like a weapon in his hand. With the calculated precision of a man who had spent his life manipulating the weaknesses of others, he made his way to Kael's sanctuary on the ridge. The air was so cold it felt brittle, yet Baron moved with a feverish heat, his heart racing with the thrill of a hunter approaching the final kill. He slipped into the cave, the scent of cedar and old pine needles, a sharp contrast to the sulfur of the mines, and located the tattered sheepskin bed where Kael slept. He slid the pouch deep into the straw, ensuring that the leather was hidden but would be easily discovered by a trained searcher. He lingered for a moment, looking down at the sleeping youth, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. The following morning, Baron orchestrated a performance of frantic panic, claiming that the camp's emergency reserve, the very gold meant to secure the winter's survival for the families, had been plundered from the secure lockbox. He didn't just point fingers. He sowed the seeds of a lynch mob, feeding the desperation of the miners until their hunger turned into a lethal rage. He whispered to Grogan and the others that he had seen a silent shadow moving toward the northern ridge in the early hours, a lie that caught fire instantly in the dry, oxygen-starved air of the valley. The mob reached Kael's cave just as the first grey light of a storm-heavy sun hit the peaks. They didn't ask questions. They tore through his meager belongings with a feral intensity, their lanterns casting dancing, jagged shadows on the cave walls. When Grogan finally pulled the heavy pouch from the straw, the collective roar of the miners was more terrifying than any blizzard. Kael stood paralyzed, his hands moving in a desperate fluid language of innocence that no one cared to interpret. His lack of a voice was the perfect seal for the snare Baron had built. Baron delivered a blow with the butt of his rifle that sent Kael sprawling into the soot-stained slush, the copper taste of blood filling the youth's mouth as he realized the trap had fully closed. He saw the glee in Baron's eyes, a look of absolute triumph that told him there would be no trial, only a swift and brutal end. In a moment of clarity born from the rawest survival instinct, Kael didn't wait for the next blow. He rolled beneath the heavy boots of the miners, his body as lean and agile as a mountain cat, and lunged toward the dense thicket of hemlocks that bordered his home. Behind him, the shouts of the mob and the baying of the camp's bloodhounds shattered the morning, a cacophony of pursuit that followed him into the whiteout. Baron led the chase on his obsidian horse, his rifle unslung, and his ego fueled by the proximity of his final victory. Kael pushed himself harder than he ever had before, his lungs screaming as the sub-zero air scorched his throat, but the thought of the silver wolf and the promise to Silas gave him a secondary reservoir of strength. He was heading for the high passes, a place of vertical drops and shifting shale, where the horses would be a liability, a gamble that required him to outrun the very dogs that had been trained to kill him. The forest became a blur of dark needles and blinding white, the branches clawing at his skin as if the land itself was trying to hold him back for the hunters. He crossed a frozen stream, the ice groaning under his weight, hoping the running water beneath would mask his scent from the hounds. The air grew thinner, the temperature plummeting as the heart of the supercell finally collided with the mountain range, turning the world into a chaotic void of wind and ice. Baron was relentless, his voice echoing through the canyons as he called for Kael to stop a command that sounded more like a death sentence. The chase entered the great ravine, a natural bottleneck where the wind was channeled into a lethal gale, and Kael knew he was running out of ground. He reached a clearing that looked over the entire valley, a limestone ledge where the path ended abruptly in a 1,000-foot drop. He turned to face the tree line, his chest heaving, his body trembling from exhaustion and the absolute cold. Baron emerged from the mist, his rifle leveled, his eyes burning with the madness of the hunt. The miners were right behind him, their lanterns flickering like dying stars in the gloom. The trap was absolute, the snare had tightened, and the hunter believed that the silence of the mute youth was finally about to become permanent. Kael stood at the edge of the world, a solitary figure of defiance against the overwhelming corruption of men, waiting for the final act of a play that had been written in the blood of the frontier. He looked at the rifle barrel, then at the swirling white abyss behind him, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a victim. He was a witness to the cruelty of the world, and he knew that even if he fell, the truth would remain etched in the silence of the mountain. The wind howled a mournful song as the hammer of the Winchester clicked back a sound that signaled the end of mercy and the beginning of the wild's judgment. The sound of the rifle hammer locking into place was a sharp mechanical punctuation to the howling chaos of the storm. Kael stood on the precipice, his boots inches from the crumbling edge of the great ravine, his breath coming in shallow, ragged plumes that were instantly torn away by the gale. Baron stepped down from his stallion, his movements slow and deliberate, savoring the final moments of a hunt that had consumed his thoughts for months. The miners had formed a semicircle, their faces gaunt and hollow, looking like ghosts in the failing light of the afternoon. They were no longer men. They were a pack of scavengers waiting for the kill that would supposedly restore their stolen gold. Baron leaned in his face inches from Kael's, his voice a low, venomous hiss that was barely audible over the wind. The mountain doesn't care about the truth, Kael. It only cares about who is left standing to tell the story. He raised the Winchester, the muzzle cold and black against the grey sky, his finger tightening on the trigger with a lethal intent. But before the firing pin could strike, a sound erupted from the ridges above that made the very marrow of the men's bones vibrate. It was a long, haunting howl that carried the weight of ancient centuries, a cry of sovereign authority that silenced the wind and the barking of the hounds. From the jagged rim of the canyon, dozens of amber eyes ignited in the gloom, a constellation of predators watching from the shadows of the frost-laden pines. A massive figure stepped onto a ledge of slate, its fur, a brilliant silver that seemed to catch what little light remained in the sky. It was the Alpha, the creature with the white star on its chest, its presence radiating a power that made the armed men feel like children. The wolf didn't snarl. It simply looked down at the clearing with a detached, terrifying intelligence, its gaze locking onto Baron with a recognition that was absolute. Slowly, the pack began to descend, the steep inclines moving with a fluid, silent grace that made the hunters look clumsy and frail. They fanned out with military precision, cutting off every exit and surrounding the miners until the clearing became a theater of primal justice. Baron's dogs, the fierce hounds that had been bred for blood, suddenly whimpered and tucked their tails, retreating behind the horses in a display of total submission to the true kings of the north. The air grew heavy with the scent of wild musk and the crushing weight of a predator's focus, a pressure that seemed to solidify the swirling snow. The silver alpha walked directly into the center of the clearing, stopping only a few paces from Kael, and for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, the man and the beast shared a look of profound, unspoken brotherhood. It was a silent acknowledgement of the debt forged in the cave, a pact that transcended the petty greed of the camp. The wolf then turned its head toward Baron, its upper lip curling back to reveal fangs that were white and sharp as bone. The growl that followed was low and subterranean, a sound that felt like the mountain itself was speaking. The miners began to back away, their lanterns trembling, their desire for gold completely replaced by an overwhelming primal terror. They saw that the wolves weren't hunting them as prey. They were acting as guardians for the youth they had just tried to kill. Grogan dropped his pickaxe, his knees buckling, as he realized that the silent freak was protected by the most dangerous force in the wilderness. Baron tried to swing his rifle toward the alpha, but a sharp bark from the shadows behind him made him freeze the realization, dawning on him that he was seconds away from being torn apart. The power dynamic had shifted with a violent cosmic finality. Kael didn't move, he didn't point, and he didn't gloat. He simply stood as the center of a storm that he had no need to control. The wolves were his voice, their presence a physical manifestation of a truth that didn't need words to be heard. The wind died down into a vacuum of sound, where only the heavy rhythmic breathing of the pack could be heard, the sound of a jury that had already reached its verdict. Baron looked at the silver wolf, then at the rifle in his hands, and finally at the men who were abandoning him. He realized that in the eyes of the mountain, he was the intruder, he was the thief, and he was the one who was truly alone. The white star on the wolf's chest seemed to pulse with an inner light, a beacon of a morality that the overseer had never understood. The pack didn't need to attack. Their presence alone was a psychological weapon that dismantled the hunter's resolve. Baron dropped his rifle into the snow, the weapon sinking out of sight, as if the earth itself was swallowing the instrument of his malice. He took a staggering step back, his eyes wide with a terror that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The alpha let out a single short bark, a command that echoed through the ravine like a gavel striking a bench. In unison, the pack shifted, opening a narrow corridor through the trees, a path that led away from Kael and back toward the camp. It was a mercy, but a mercy with conditions. The miners didn't wait. They scrambled for the opening, leaving their pride and their lanterns in the mud as they fled into the storm, their screams lost in the rising howl of the wind. Baron followed them, stumbling and falling, his horse bolting into the darkness as he realized he had lost everything in the pursuit of a silent man's life. Kael was left alone in the clearing with the wolves, the silence returning to the gorge, but it was a different kind of silence. Now, a peaceful, hallowed, quiet that felt like a sanctuary. The alpha stepped closer, pressing its massive head against Kael's chest. For a fleeting second, the warmth of the animal's fur, a stark contrast to the sub-zero air. The debt had been repaid in full, not with gold or silver, but with the preservation of a soul. The pack then vanished back into the mist as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Kael standing at the edge of the cliff, a survivor of a trial that no human court could ever replicate. He was Kael the mute driver, and he was finally free from the chains of the Iron Crag. The atmosphere thickened as the hunters suddenly realized they were the ones who had become the prey. The air in the great ravine seemed to solidify, turning into a heavy, suffocating shroud that pressed against the lungs of every man present. Baron stood paralyzed, his eyes bulging as he watched the silver alpha, the creature he had intended to skin for profit years ago, step into the center of the clearing with the authority of an ancient king. The contrast was stark and terrifying. While the wolves emitted low, guttural snarls that vibrated through the limestone floor whenever Baron or his men made the slightest movement, their demeanor shifted entirely when their golden gazes landed on Kael. The massive silver wolf, known to the mountain as White Star, lowered its massive head, its ears flattening in a gesture of profound submission and recognition that silenced the wind itself. It was a sight that defied every law of nature known to the frontier, a moment where the binary of predator and prey was erased by the memory of a single act of mercy. The rest of the pack followed their leader's lead, their hackles smoothing over as they fanned out to form a living wall between Kael and his persecutors, their amber eyes flickering like dying embers in the shadows of the storm. Baron's knees buckled the rifle he had dropped, now half buried in the snow like a discarded toy, as the reality of his isolation took hold. His men, the very Thermor he had manipulated with lies of stolen gold and starvation, were no longer looking at Kael with hatred, but at Baron with a mixture of dawning realization and primal terror. The silver alpha let out a sharp, commanding bark that echoed through the gorge like a thunderclap, and the pack tightened the circle, their fangs bared in a silent ultimatum. Panic, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced the hearts of the mob. Grogan was the first to break his heavy boots, slipping on the ice as he turned and fled toward the narrow exit, his pickaxe clattering against the stones as he abandoned his pride for the chance to breathe another day. The other miners followed suit, tripping over one another in a desperate, chaotic scramble to escape the amber-eyed judges of the forest. In their frantic flight, they left behind everything, their lanterns, their heavy coats, and the heavy leather pouch of raw gold that Baron had dropped in his panic. The pouch lay open on the white powder, its contents shimmering with a cold, metallic light that served as a silent confession of Baron's greed. Baron himself was left stumbling in the rear, his face a mask of cowardice, as he realized that the mute freak he had tried to destroy was the only human being the mountain chose to protect. The wolves did not hunt them. They simply watched with a chilling, detached intelligence as the men disappeared into the whiteout, their screams of terror fading into the roar of the blizzard. Once the clearing was empty of the camp's corruption, a hallowed silence returned to the ravine, broken only by the rhythmic breathing of the pack. White Star turned back toward Kael, the white star on its chest glowing brilliantly against the silver fur. For the first time in 3 years, the distance between them closed. Kael stepped forward, his movements slow and reverent, his frozen fingers reaching out with a trembling hope. As his palm finally made contact with the thick, coarse fur of the wolf's chest, touching the very center of the white star, a surge of warmth seemed to flow through his entire body, thawing the bitterness that had frozen his soul. The fur was warm, smelling of pine needles and the raw, clean scent of the high altitudes. It was a tactile confirmation of the bond they had forged in the cave, a debt of blood and fire that had now been settled with the gift of life. Kael looked into the wolf's amber eyes and saw not a beast but a witness to his true character, a being that understood his silence better than any man ever could. The alpha leaned its weight into Kael's hand for a fleeting moment, a sacred embrace in the heart of the storm, before pulling back with a dignified grace. The pack began to retreat into the shadows of the hemlocks, their shapes blending into the swirling mist until they were once again ghosts of the great north. Kael stood alone in the clearing, but he was no longer a victim. He was a man who had been vindicated by the highest court in existence. He looked down at the snow and saw the gold pouch Baron had discarded, a physical piece of evidence that would prove his innocence to anyone who dared to listen. But as he gripped the leather, he realized he didn't need the camp's approval anymore. The wilderness had given its verdict, and that was enough. He felt the weight of the promise he had made to Silas, lifting, replaced by a new, soaring sense of purpose. The injustice of the Iron Crag was a distant memory, a dark valley he had finally climbed out of. He took a deep breath of the crystalline air, the cold no longer biting but invigorating, as he prepared to descend the mountain not as a fugitive, but as a master of his own destiny. The silver wolf let out one final haunting howl from the ridge above, a sound that wasn't a warning, but a farewell to a brother. Kael watched the silhouette of White Star vanish into the white expanse, knowing that while they might never meet again, they would always share the same heartbeat. The silence of the gorge was now a symphony of peace, a space where the mute youth finally found his power. He began the long walk back toward his mules, his steps firm and certain, leaving behind the ghosts of the dead-end gorge and the man he used to be. The gold in his hand was just metal, but the memory of the touch on the White Star was a treasure that no thief could ever steal. He was Kael, the one who spoke through mercy, and the mountain would always remember his name. As the hazy dawn emerged, the dark mining region receded behind Kael forever. The first rays of a fragile winter sun bled across the jagged horizon, staining the vast sheets of ice in hues of rose and pale gold. Yet the light no longer felt like a cold interrogation. Kael steered his sled away from the iron crag, the runners cutting smooth, confident tracks through the fresh powder that had buried the sins of the previous night. In his vest pocket, the heavy weight of the leather pouch was a solid metallic reassurance, not just of wealth, but of a truth that had been physically retrieved from the clutches of a coward. He did not look back at the soot-stained valley or the crumbling shafts where greed had nearly extinguished his life, for his heart was already traversing the distant greener ridges of the south. The journey was long, a pilgrimage through a landscape that was beginning to breathe again after the fury of the supercell. He passed the great ravine, where the silence was now sacred rather than suffocating, and crossed the frozen river that had once been his boundary of servitude. As he reached the highest crest of the border mountains, the point where the air grew sweet with the scent of distant pines and unfrozen earth, a sound rose from the depths of the ancient forest. It was a chorus of howls, a primal symphony of high-pitched yips and deep, resonant barks that climbed the granite walls and filled the entire vault of the sky. Kael stopped his mules, standing on the edge of the world, as the echoes of the White Star Pack washed over him like a final majestic salute. It was a farewell from the only family that had truly seen his soul, a promise that the wild would always keep a place for the man who brought fire to the freezing. He felt a profound sense of equilibrium, a realization that while the world of men was often governed by the jagged edges of cruelty, the world of the wild operated on a much older, more honest system of debts and balances. Nature was not cruel. It was simply fair, a mirror that reflected the mercy or malice a man chose to carry within him. Kael looked toward the southern valleys, where the snow was already giving way to the dark, fertile soil of a new beginning, a place where he could build a life that required no voice to be valued. He understood now that his silence had never been a cage, but a filter that allowed him to hear the heartbeat of the mountain and the whispers of the creatures that most men were too loud to notice. The gold he carried would buy him land and tools, but the memory of the amber eyes and the touch of the white star fur would buy him peace. As the howls faded into the distance, leaving only the soft whistling of the wind, Kael took out a small, leather-bound journal that Silas had given him years ago, a relic of a man who believed in the power of the written word. He didn't write about the gold or the betrayal. He wrote about the warmth of a silver flank in a blizzard and the way justice feels when it arrives on four paws. He realized that the greatest stories aren't told through the mouth, but through the hands that help and the hearts that endure when everyone else has turned away. The lesson for those who might one day find his tracks in the snow was clear compassion is the only fire that can't be put out by a storm. We live in a world that often demands we be loud, aggressive, and selfish to survive. Yet the true masters of the wilderness are those who know when to be still and when to show mercy to a fallen enemy. Kael's journey was a testament to the fact that a single week of kindness can outweigh a lifetime of brutality, creating a ripple that spans years and mountain ranges. The hunters had become the prey not because of the wolves' hunger, but because of their own spiritual starvation, while Kael had thrived because his soul was fed by a promise. He moved forward into the sunlight, a silent man walking toward a horizon of infinite possibility, leaving the shadows of the mine to be reclaimed by the ice. The values he carried were more durable than any ore pulled from the dark earth, a legacy of silent compassion that would endure long after the iron crag was forgotten by time. This was the strange, beautiful truth of his existence, that by saving a life he could have easily taken, he had ultimately saved his own. The world would always be cold for some, but for Kael, the fire he had shared 3 years ago would burn forever in his chest, a light that no winter could ever dim. He was no longer the mute mule driver of a lawless camp. He was a witness to the miraculous, a brother to the wild, and a man who knew the true cost of a life. As the last echo of the Alpha's howl vanished into the blue, Kael smiled, a quiet expression of absolute freedom that needed no sound to fill the valley. The lesson remained. For anyone watching the snow fall, kindness is the only language the deaf can hear and the mute can speak, a universal currency of the spirit that never loses its value.